press conference today because of all the reasons that you have just explained. I do appreciate very much WHO's focus on the most vulnerable, including the refugees, displaced, stateless people that my organization deals with. It's also very significant, I think, that we have decided to speak together to the media today, the day before World Refugee Day, which is observed tomorrow, and which in this context this year takes particular significance. It is also significant that we do this the day after we issued our yearly report on forced displacement figures. They refer to 2019, and as you mentioned, they're very dramatic. I've already spoken to the press about this, but let me repeat what I guess most of you know already. We reported a dramatic increase in displacement figures last year compared to the year before. We're close to 80 million people that are either refugees or displaced in their own country. And this means, in simple terms, that 1% of humanity lives today in situations of forced exile. You also already mentioned, Tedros, a very important and significant statistic. 80, in fact, sometimes we could even say almost 85% of the refugees and practically all the displaced people, the internally displaced people, live in countries that, contrary to the political rhetoric, are usually countries that are either poor or middle-income countries, not countries with a lot of resources. This means, since I'm speaking from WHO headquarters, countries that not only have fragile institutions, fragile economies, but also often fragile health systems. And this is something that we need to reflect on. I would also add another couple of statistics. One is that over 40% of the people we're talking about are people below 18 years of age. So a very big prevalence of young people, children or very young people, and of course a very big prevalence of women over men, because many of the refugees are in fact women, often women that are also breadwinners and have children in their responsibility. It's also interesting that 2/3 of the figure is not refugees that have crossed borders, but refugees in their own countries, internally displaced people. These people are people that are more difficult often to access for all of us in the humanitarian community. Why? Because they are in the middle of conflict. And these are the places where, as we know very well, and you have spoken about this very clearly over the past few months, and I'm very grateful for that, places like Yemen, places like certain parts of Syria, places like Libya are the places where doing work, health work also for the vulnerable is extremely, extremely difficult. And finally, one more telling statistic. The figure we reported yesterday is about double the same figure 10 years ago. So in 10 years, the figure of forced displacement have doubled. What does this mean? This means that the space, the opportunities for solving forced displacement are receding. We estimate that in the 90s, about 1.5 million refugees and displaced went back every year in operations of voluntary repatriation. We're down to less than 400,000 a year that avail themselves of these opportunities. This means that, as I've said many, many times, and yesterday I was invited also to brief the Security Council on this, we are living in a world in which making peace is becoming very difficult. New conflicts emerge and add themselves to old conflicts, like in Afghanistan, like to an extent in Somalia, despite improvements, and other places where conflicts continue to displace people and inflict suffering on civilians. A few more words just to say that on this situation, we now have the additional complication of the pandemic. So I won't speak about the pandemic because, of course, the experts are here in WHO, but I would like to add a few points to what you already said. Though we have not seen, or not seen yet, I should say, major outbreaks where we feared the most, in large concentration, in refugee camps traditionally, like in Bangladesh, for example. We've seen cases, we've seen some small outbreaks, but not the catastrophic outbreaks that we were fearing at the beginning because of the lack of social distancing, the lack of water and sanitation facilities, and so forth. I think this is also due to the fact that in many of these situations, we had time to prepare. And there is where our cooperation with WHO has been invaluable, because it is WHO, and I want to stress it, and many of my humanitarian colleagues can say the same, that has provided us throughout these difficult months with leadership and technical guidance, without which we would not have been able to achieve whatever we have been able to achieve. So it's for me also an opportunity to thank the Director General and to thank WHO staff worldwide for the support that you have provided to us in these very, very difficult months. But of course, we hear what WHO keeps telling us. We need to maintain that vigilance high in those situations. And remember, the majority of refugees and displaced are actually not in refugee camps. They are in communities, and those communities in some places have been devastated already by the pandemic. I'm thinking of Latin America, where 17, 18 countries host more than 4 million Venezuelans on the move. I'm thinking of many urban centers in Africa that are host to large refugee populations. I'm thinking of Afghans in Pakistan and Iran that share facilities and accommodation with communities that have been impacted very severely by COVID. And throughout these situations, what worries us, and perhaps at this point, from our perspective, even more than the health impact, is the impact on livelihoods. Refugees and migrants depend essentially on daily wages, on very fragile income, on that informal economy which lockdowns eliminate very quickly. So a lot of the jobs of the very thin livelihoods on which refugees depend have already disappeared. And this is causing enormous vulnerability on people that depend on these incomes. Vulnerabilities that translate also into health vulnerabilities, because in many places to access health facilities costs money, which is not there anymore. I would like to make a final comment. The key issue that we have been impressing on governments is that refugees, displaced people, other people on the move, must be included in national health responses. And this is, again, an area in which we have cooperated very well with WHO. I have to say that in most countries this has happened. There was a clear understanding that if you excluded this population, it would be actually a liability for the rest of the population as well. So I want to thank all governments for having done this. The next campaign for inclusion will be tougher, and it is inclusion in social and economic responses. That will be more difficult to include refugees and displaced people. It will be more difficult economically because it costs a lot of money. It will be difficult politically in many countries, but I want to use this forum to appeal to states to think of that. I've reached out already. We've reached out to the World Bank, to the International Monetary Fund, which are putting in place rescue packages for fragile economies, to tell them, take into account when you plan this with governments that some of those states have the additional responsibility of hosting large refugee populations. And I have to say that both the IMF and the World Bank have been very responsive on that. So thank you very much. I can only conclude by echoing what the Director General said. I hope, as has been said many times, that the pandemic will be an opportunity for all of us to reflect on the need to move away from the rhetoric of me first, my country first, and to work together in a unanimous manner. Yesterday, I briefed the Security Council, as I said, and this was my main message. Please put aside your divisions. As the DG said, let's depoliticize these issues. This is valid for the pandemic, and this is valid also in dealing with refugee and migration issues. Thank you very much, Dr. Tedros.
Thank you, Filippo. That was really, really great. And